A young bank CEO named Alexandra Brooks laughed aloud in a meeting the moment she learned the new ATM systems technician had once been an unemployed single father for several years. She saw that history as proof of failure and quietly told her staff to replace him once the upgrade project ended. 2 hours later, 81 hostages were locked inside that very bank by a crew of armed intruders carrying out a long and flawless plan. The only person who truly understood the building's hidden security architecture was the man she had just dismissed with a laugh, Carter Reed. The headquarters of National Trust Bank rose 30 stories above the financial district, all glass and polished steel, a building designed to project certainty in every reflection. On the top floor, Alexandra Brooks walked through her Monday review with the brisk confidence of someone who had never once doubted her own judgment. She was 33 years old and had already rebuilt the bank's entire digital infrastructure twice, trusting numbers over instinct and credentials over character. That morning, she was reviewing the final stage of a security systems upgrade, a project meant to modernize every vault, every terminal, and every layer of protection the bank relied upon. A contract technician had been brought in to handle the final calibration of the automated teller network, a quiet man named Carter Reed who arrived early, said little, and moved through the server room with the ease of someone who had built such systems long before he ever repaired them. He was 35, broad-shouldered but soft-spoken, the kind of man whose eyes tracked every detail in a room without ever seeming to look for it. He had once designed security architecture for banks twice this size, though nothing in his current uniform suggested it. A junior manager trying to make polite conversation during the walkthrough mentioned offhand that Carter had spent nearly 4 years unemployed before taking maintenance contracts, raising a single father alone after a rough divorce. Alexandra laughed, not cruelly exactly, but with the easy dismissiveness of someone who had never needed anyone else's help to survive. She remarked that a man who could not hold a career together for years was hardly the person she wanted anywhere near her bank's most sensitive systems, and she asked human resources to quietly arrange his replacement once the contract ended. Carter heard every word. He did not argue, did not explain, and did not so much as glance up from the terminal in front of him. He simply kept working, his hands steady on the keyboard, his attention fixed on lines of code that told a story most people in that room would never think to read. Something in the authentication logs caught his eye, a pattern of access requests routed through an old subsystem that should have been retired years earlier, quietly still active beneath the bank's newer layers of protection. He flagged the anomaly in his report that afternoon, describing in careful technical language a vulnerability buried deep in the legacy framework, one that could theoretically grant control over the vault's isolation protocols if exploited correctly. The report reached a mid-level security officer who skimmed it, decided it was outside the scope of Carter's contract, and filed it without escalation. Nobody mentioned it to Alexandra. Nobody thought a maintenance technician's warning was worth interrupting an executive schedule. By the time Carter packed up his tools that evening, the bank's newest defenses gleamed under bright lighting, cameras sweeping every corridor, biometric locks sealing every vault door, executives congratulating themselves on a flawless modernization. Carter walked out through the lobby without a word to anyone, carrying with him the quiet knowledge that somewhere inside those confident new systems sat a door nobody else even knew existed. He did not know yet how soon that door would matter, or how many lives would depend on whether anyone remembered his name before it was too late. Outside, the evening air felt cooler than the sterile hum of the server room, and Carter allowed himself a slow breath before walking toward the bus stop 3 blocks away, since the contract work rarely covered parking downtown. He thought briefly of his daughter waiting at his sister's apartment, of the dinner he still needed to prepare, of the ordinary rhythms of a life he had rebuilt piece by piece after everything else had been taken from him. The laughter from that meeting still echoed faintly in the back of his mind, though he had long since trained himself not to let such moments linger. He had learned through years of quiet humiliation that arguing rarely changed anyone's opinion, and that the only real answer to being underestimated was simply to keep doing the work well. Still, some small part of him recognized the particular sting of being dismissed inside a building he himself had once helped design from nothing, a truth none of these executives had bothered to uncover before forming their opinions of him. He tucked the thought away, the way he tucked away most things, and boarded the bus home without looking back at the glowing tower behind him. The following morning arrived ordinary and unremarkable, sunlight sliding across the marble floor of the bank's main branch as tellers unlocked their stations and the first customers filtered through the revolving doors. Nobody noticed the 4 men in delivery uniforms who entered through the loading dock an hour before opening, carrying crates marked as routine equipment shipments. Nobody noticed because they were never meant to be noticed, every movement rehearsed across years of planning, every uniform and badge forged with meticulous precision. Their leader was a man named Damien Cole, lean and unhurried, with the calm demeanor of someone who had spent a previous career designing the very security systems he now intended to defeat. He had once consulted for banks exactly like this one, understood their architecture from the inside, and had spent years quietly mapping every weakness this particular building's systems still carried. He was not interested in the cash drawers or the safety deposit boxes that most robbers might target. He wanted something far more valuable buried deep in the bank's central servers. At exactly 9:15, as the lobby filled with the morning rush of customers and employees, Damien's team moved in unison. Silent alarms were bypassed through access codes stolen months earlier. Reinforced blast doors installed as part of the very upgrade Carter had just finished calibrating slammed shut across every exit, sealing the building from the outside world in under 90 seconds. Communication lines were severed. Cell signals inside the structure dropped to nothing. 81 people, employees and customers alike, found themselves trapped inside a building that had just been fitted with the most advanced containment system the bank had ever installed. Alexandra was 3 floors up in a strategy meeting when the alarms cut out entirely, replaced by an eerie silence that told her something had gone deeply wrong. Security footage flickered and froze on false loops, feeding false calm to anyone monitoring remotely while armed men moved unseen through the true feed below. By the time she reached the executive floor's emergency panel, every system she tried to access refused her credentials, locked behind protocols she did not recognize and had never personally authorized. Downstairs, employees were herded into the main lobby at gunpoint, forced to sit in tight rows along the cold marble floor while Damien's men fanned out toward the vault level. The bank's own security guards, trained for robberies and confrontations, found their radios dead and their access badges suddenly meaningless against doors that no longer responded to any credential but Damien's own. Within minutes, the entire ground floor security detail had been disarmed and restrained without a single shot fired, the efficiency of it almost clinical. Outside, the first police units arrived within 8 minutes of the initial silent alarm trigger, but found themselves staring at a building that had, in effect, sealed itself shut. Blast-resistant doors meant to keep intruders out now kept everyone trapped inside, an unintended consequence of a system built for a different kind of threat. As sirens gathered along the perimeter and news vans began setting up cameras across the street, nobody yet understood that the person who best knew how to open that building again had been dismissed from its payroll less than 24 hours earlier. Inside the sealed lobby, the atmosphere shifted quickly from confusion to a taut, suffocating stillness. Employees who had spent the morning discussing lunch plans and quarterly targets now sat, pressed shoulder to shoulder against cold marble, afraid to speak above a whisper. A young teller near the front counted the armed men repeatedly, as though counting alone might reveal some hidden exit the rest of them had missed. An older security guard, disarmed and humiliated, kept his eyes fixed on the floor, replaying in his mind every point where he might have reacted differently. Damien moved among his hostages with an unsettling calm, offering water to anyone who asked and speaking in a measured, almost courteous tone that made the entire scene feel more unnerving rather than less. He had planned for panic, for resistance, for every ordinary reaction fear might produce, and he handled each with practiced patience, never raising his voice, never allowing the operation's precision to slip. It was clear to anyone watching closely that this was not a man improvising under pressure, but one executing a plan rehearsed over years of preparation. By mid-morning, the block surrounding National Trust Bank had become a fortress of flashing lights and hurried command tents, a scene assembled with the speed only a crisis of this size could summon. A regional SWAT unit had established a perimeter within the hour, their commanders poring over blueprints that were already outdated, since the building's most recent security overhaul had never been fully documented outside the bank's own internal files. Every attempt to breach a side entrance met the same result: doors that would not yield to any conventional method they carried. An FBI cyber response team arrived shortly after, technicians unpacking laptops and specialized hardware meant to override compromised systems remotely. They worked with practiced urgency, running through known exploits and manufacturer backdoors, but the deeper they dug, the more it became clear that this security framework did not match anything in their reference libraries. The architecture had been customized, layered, and quietly rebuilt years earlier by someone whose name did not appear on any current employee roster. Inside, Alexandra sat pressed against a cold pillar in the lobby, watching armed men pace calmly between rows of frightened hostages, her earlier composure cracking beneath a fear she had never had to manage in a boardroom. She kept replaying the morning's meeting in her mind, the calm certainty with which she'd dismissed a man's entire career based on a single sentence about his past. It felt suddenly like an entirely different kind of arrogance than she had ever recognized in herself. Near the vault level, Damien moved with unhurried confidence, addressing his hostages only when necessary, his attention mostly fixed on a terminal he had wired directly into the bank's central servers. At one point, almost as an aside to a lieutenant beside him, he mentioned that the system's foundation had been built on an older framework, one that only its original architect would fully understand, a detail he had apparently studied for years while preparing this operation. He seemed almost amused that the bank itself had no idea who that architect truly was. Word of that architecture detail eventually reached Alexandra through a whispered exchange between two employees crouched nearby, employees who had worked on the recent upgrade and recognized the description instantly. It matched almost exactly the technician who had been in the building only the day before, the one she had laughed at without a second thought. She felt something cold settle in her chest as the pieces began to align, though she still could not quite believe the connection was real. Outside, negotiators tried repeatedly to establish contact through emergency lines, receiving only silence in return, while commanders debated increasingly dangerous options for a forced entry that specialists warned could trigger a permanent lockdown of the lower levels. Somewhere in that discussion, a junior officer mentioned a name pulled from the bank's contractor logs, a name attached to the very upgrade report that had been dismissed and filed away less than a day earlier. It reached Alexandra's assistant within minutes, and from there reached Alexandra herself, arriving like a memory she suddenly wished she had taken more seriously. She sat with the name for a long moment before saying anything, staring at the grainy security monitor that still occasionally flickered with fragments of true footage between the looping false feed. Carter Reed. She remembered the sound of her own laughter in that meeting room, remembered dismissing an entire career with barely a thought, and felt a slow, uncomfortable recognition settle over her that had nothing to do with the armed men now controlling her building. An FBI negotiator crouched beside her, asking whether she recognized the name from anywhere relevant to the current crisis, and Alexandra found herself explaining, haltingly, that the man in question had been on site only the day before, working on precisely the systems now being exploited against them. She did not mention the meeting, did not mention her own words, only that he had filed a report about anomalies in the network that nobody had escalated. It was, she realized even as she said it, the first time all day she had told anyone the complete truth about anything. Carter was at home, standing in a small kitchen that smelled faintly of coffee, when two federal agents knocked on his door with an urgency that told him something serious had happened before they even spoke. He had spent the previous evening quietly reviewing his own notes on the anomaly he had flagged, half expecting nobody would ever call about it. Now, watching the agents explain what was unfolding downtown, he felt the strange weight of being right about something he had wished he was wrong about. He did not ask about the woman who had laughed at him, did not mention the report that had been ignored, did not waste a single sentence on resentment. He asked only how many people were trapped inside, and how much time investigators believed they had before the situation deteriorated further. When the agents admitted their own specialists could not crack the system's architecture, Carter simply nodded and reached for his jacket, already running calculations in his mind about which subsystems the intruders were most likely targeting. At the command post, he was handed a tablet showing partial schematics, and within minutes he identified gaps that the official documentation had never captured, hidden pathways he himself had built years earlier during his original tenure designing the bank's security framework. He explained, calmly and without a hint of vindication, that the men inside were not interested in the vault's cash reserves at all. Their target was the central data servers, which stored years of sensitive financial records tied to some of the bank's largest institutional clients. He warned the assembled commanders that any forced attempt to breach the reinforced containment doors through conventional methods carried a serious risk, since the system had been designed with a fail-safe that would permanently seal the lower levels if it detected unauthorized tampering. If that fail-safe triggered, the 81 hostages trapped below ground would have no way out, not through rescue efforts, not through negotiation, not through anything short of a controlled shutdown that only the original architecture allowed. Federal commanders, desperate and out of options, agreed to let Carter guide the response despite his lack of official clearance, an irony that was not lost on anyone who had read his dismissal notice from the day before. He asked for direct access to a secure terminal linked to the building's backup network, one small and forgotten pathway that predated the recent upgrade entirely, a pathway he alone remembered still existed beneath layers of newer code. As he settled into the makeshift command tent, surrounded by agents twice his rank and none of his history with this particular system, Carter made one request above all others. Nobody was to attempt manual overrides, nobody was to force entry, and nobody was to act without confirming through him first, because a single wrong command could cost 81 lives in an instant. The room fell quiet, and for the first time that day, everyone present understood that the man once dismissed as unqualified was now the only person capable of saving them all. A senior agent, still skeptical of handing this much authority to a civilian contractor, asked pointedly how Carter could be certain of details that his own trained specialists had failed to identify. Carter answered without defensiveness, explaining plainly that he had built the original framework himself years earlier, long before the current security team had ever touched the system, and that certain design choices simply were not documented anywhere accessible to newer engineers. It was not arrogance in his voice, only the quiet certainty of a man stating a fact he had lived with for a very long time. Someone brought him a folding chair and a laptop wired into the recovered backup terminal, and Carter settled into the work with the same unhurried focus he brought to every repair job, regardless of how much attention or how many lives now depended on the outcome. He thought briefly of his daughter, of the babysitter who had promised to stay late without knowing why, and pushed the thought firmly aside, knowing that 81 families were waiting on precisely the kind of concentration he could not afford to lose. Carter worked from the backup terminal with the quiet focus of a man reassembling a puzzle he had built with his own hands years earlier. He traced Damien's movements through fragments of system activity, watching login attempts ripple through subsystems in patterns that revealed far more than Damien likely realized. Every command the intruders issued left a faint signature, and Carter began mapping those signatures against the architecture only he fully understood, slowly building a picture of exactly where inside the vault level Damien's team was operating. Within an hour he had isolated a secondary camera network, an older system left in place as a redundant backup during the recent upgrade, one that had never been folded into the primary feed Damien's team had seized control of. Carter rerouted a narrow stream of footage to the command tent without triggering any alert on the intruder's end, giving federal commanders their first real glimpse of hostage positions in nearly 2 hours. Alexandra appeared on that grainy feed seated among her own employees, no longer the composed executive who had dismissed him a day earlier but a frightened woman watching armed men pace nearby. Seeing her there struck Carter with an unexpected quiet, not satisfaction, not anger, simply the recognition that the woman who had judged his worth by his past now depended entirely on the very expertise she had dismissed. He said nothing about it to the agents around him, focused instead on identifying which subsystems remained vulnerable to Damien's next likely move. He noticed, through subtle shifts in server load, that Damien's technician was probing toward the central data vault, exactly the target he had warned commanders about earlier. Damien, for his part, sensed something interfering with his access almost as quickly as Carter established it. He paused his own team's progress, running a diagnostic that revealed unfamiliar traffic threading quietly through a pathway he did not recognize as active. His expression shifted from confidence to genuine curiosity, understanding that someone with intimate knowledge of this system's true architecture was working against him in real time, someone who was not part of any official response team he had anticipated. What followed became a silent contest fought entirely through code, each man probing the other's movements, testing boundaries, searching for an advantage neither dared reveal too plainly. Carter fed subtle false signals into peripheral systems, delaying Damien's technician without revealing his own position, buying precious minutes for federal negotiators to reassess their options outside. Damien, in turn, began locking down secondary pathways one by one, suspecting correctly that his unseen opponent was using exactly the kind of backdoor only an original architect would know existed. By late afternoon, both men understood they were facing someone who matched their own expertise almost precisely, an unsettling realization for Damien, who had spent years believing no one alive still remembered this system's original design. For Carter, it confirmed something he had already suspected, that whoever planned this operation had studied the bank's infrastructure with the same obsessive detail he once had himself, which meant the coming hours would require every ounce of patience and precision he still possessed. The command tent grew quieter as the hours wore on, agents pacing near the monitors while Carter remained almost motionless, his eyes moving steadily across lines of activity most of them could not begin to interpret. Occasionally he narrated a fragment of what he saw, translating the silent digital contest into language the commanders could act upon, but mostly he worked in a focused silence that nobody dared interrupt. Alexandra's face, still visible in flickers on the recovered camera feed, remained a quiet reminder of exactly what was at stake with every decision he made. At one point, Carter noticed Damien pause his intrusion attempts entirely, an unusual stillness in the data traffic that suggested the other man was reconsidering his approach rather than retreating. It was, Carter recognized, the behavior of someone confident enough to slow down, to think several steps ahead rather than react purely on instinct, and that recognition unsettled him more than any aggressive countermeasure could have. Whoever Damien was, he was not simply a criminal improvising an opportunity. He was an equal, working from the same architecture, driven by a purpose Carter had not yet fully understood. As the standoff stretched into evening, one of the federal agents ran a deeper background check on Carter, curious how a maintenance technician possessed such intimate command of the bank's most complex systems. What surfaced was a story buried under years of paperwork and quiet humiliation, a story nobody at National Trust Bank had bothered to uncover before dismissing him. Carter had, in fact, been the original architect of the security framework the bank still relied upon, a system he designed nearly a decade earlier under an entirely different company that had since been absorbed into National Trust's larger network. According to old internal records, a senior executive at that former company had taken credit for Carter's design during a critical client presentation, rebranding years of Carter's work as his own innovation. When a data breach later exposed flaws in an unrelated part of the system, that same executive quietly redirected blame toward Carter, whose name had never been properly credited on the original documentation in the first place. Carter was dismissed within weeks, his professional reputation dismantled by accusations he had no formal standing to contest. The fallout reached far beyond his career. His marriage, already strained by long hours and mounting stress, did not survive the humiliation and financial collapse that followed. He found himself raising his child largely alone, cycling through odd jobs and short contracts, never quite able to explain to potential employers why a man with his obvious skill had vanished so completely from the industry he once helped shape. Most companies saw only a gap in his resume and drew their own conclusions, exactly as Alexandra had done less than 2 days earlier. Watching this history unfold on a briefing document handed to her by an aide, Alexandra felt something shift inside her that had little to do with the crisis still unfolding around her. She thought back to her own quick laughter, her own certainty that a man's unemployment history was evidence of some deeper failure, and realized how completely she had misunderstood what she was looking at. She had judged an architect by the wreckage of an injustice, mistaking the damage done to him for something he had done to himself. There was no time to dwell on the realization, not with 81 lives still hanging in the balance, but the shift in her understanding was immediate and total. She found herself watching the grainy security feed differently now, no longer seeing a hired technician working beyond his role, but the true builder of everything standing between her employees and disaster. For the first time since the ordeal began, she allowed herself a small, fragile hope that the man she had wronged might still choose to save her anyway. Carter, unaware that his history had just been laid bare to the very woman who dismissed him, remained entirely focused on the terminal in front of him. He had long ago made peace with what happened to his career, choosing steady, quiet work over bitter pursuit of vindication he doubted would ever come. Whatever Alexandra now understood about him mattered less in this moment than the 81 people whose survival depended on decisions he was making one careful command at a time. There had been a period years earlier when Carter believed he might fight back through legal avenues, when he had consulted lawyers and gathered whatever fragments of documentation he could still access. But the former executive who had claimed his work carried influence and resources Carter simply did not possess, and after months of dead ends and mounting legal fees he could not afford, he had quietly let the matter go, choosing instead to focus on his daughter and the fragile stability they still had left together. That choice had cost him more than most people would ever know, a career he had built from nothing, a marriage that could not survive the strain, and a reputation reduced to a single unexplained gap that employers read however they pleased. He had grown used to swallowing that history without complaint, used to letting people draw whatever conclusions they wished about a man who repaired ATM machines instead of designing them. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped expecting anyone to look closely enough to see the difference. With the sun beginning to set behind the surrounding towers, Carter finalized a plan he had been quietly assembling for the better part of the afternoon, a sequence designed to unlock the building section by section without ever triggering the fail-safe that would seal it permanently. He walked the assembled commanders through each stage with careful precision, explaining which doors could be released first, which hostages were positioned closest to those exits, and how long each phase would take before Damien's team could realistically notice the change. The first phase targeted a service corridor on the eastern side of the building, an area holding roughly a dozen hostages who had been separated from the main group earlier that afternoon. Carter rerouted power through a legacy subsystem, releasing the corridor's magnetic locks in a sequence so gradual it barely registered as unusual activity on Damien's monitoring dashboard. SWAT operators, guided by real-time coordinates Carter fed them through the recovered camera network, moved in swiftly and extracted every hostage in that section without a single shot exchanged. Encouraged by the success, Carter moved to the second phase almost immediately, targeting a larger group held near the customer service floor. This time the release required bypassing 2 authentication layers simultaneously, a maneuver that carried real risk of detection. But Carter timed it precisely against a routine diagnostic cycle he knew Damien's technician would be distracted running elsewhere. The doors opened just long enough for another 23 hostages to be guided out through a side stairwell before the corridor sealed itself again automatically. It did not take long for Damien to notice the pattern of missing hostages rippling through his own headcount reports. He abandoned his position near the data vault, moving quickly toward the security hub to investigate, his earlier calm replaced by the sharp focus of a man realizing his operation was unraveling faster than anticipated. He ran a full system trace, finally locating the exact pathway Carter had been using, a hidden conduit he immediately began working to seal from his end. Carter felt the intrusion the instant Damien moved against him, watching his own access flicker and narrow as countermeasures activated in real time. Rather than retreat, he pushed forward with the third phase immediately, accepting the risk of exposure in exchange for releasing the remaining hostages clustered near the main lobby before his window closed entirely. Federal teams surged through a side entrance the moment the doors gave way, moving with practiced speed to clear the area while gunfire briefly erupted from one of Damien's remaining men before being swiftly contained. By the time the lobby was fully secured, the vast majority of the 81 hostages had been safely extracted, ushered into waiting ambulances and reunited with worried families gathered behind the police perimeter. Only a small group remained trapped deeper within the building, including Alexandra herself, still held near the vault level where Damien, furious and increasingly desperate, now understood exactly who had been working against him the entire afternoon. Reporters stationed along the perimeter captured the emotional scenes as families rushed forward to embrace freed employees, some sobbing openly, others simply standing in stunned silence at having survived an ordeal that had stretched across most of the day. Paramedics moved briskly among the crowd, checking for injuries and offering water and blankets against the evening chill settling over the city. For a brief moment, the mood outside the perimeter shifted from dread toward cautious relief, though everyone present understood the crisis remained far from over. Inside the command tent, Carter allowed himself only a brief nod of acknowledgement when told the extraction numbers, refusing to let the small victory distract him from the far more dangerous situation still unfolding below ground. He knew Damien would not remain passive now that his plan had visibly failed, and he began recalculating his approach for the final phase, aware that the most volatile portion of the entire operation still lay directly ahead of him. With most of the hostages freed and his operation collapsing around him, Damien made his final move, seizing Alexandra by the arm and pulling her toward the vault level's central chamber, using her as leverage against the forces now closing in from every direction. He shouted through the building's remaining intercom system that any further attempt to breach his position would trigger the very failsafe Carter had warned commanders about earlier, sealing the lower levels permanently with Alexandra still trapped inside them. Commanders outside debated a forced tactical response, but Carter argued fiercely against it, insisting that any external assault carried too great a risk given how deeply Damien now controlled the remaining active systems. He requested, instead, to negotiate directly through the terminal pathway he had already established, a request granted only after considerable hesitation from federal leadership who understood they had no better option remaining. Carter's voice reached Damien through a speaker embedded in the vault chamber's wall, calm and measured despite the tension radiating through the command tent behind him. He acknowledged Damien's technical skill openly, admitting that few people alive could have built an operation this precise, before pointing out, just as plainly, that Damien had made one critical miscalculation. The fail-safe Damien believed he controlled had actually been modified years earlier, a detail buried so deep in the original architecture that not even Damien's extensive research had uncovered it. Damien's confidence wavered for the first time as Carter explained, without revealing every technical detail, that the very system Damien intended to weaponize against his hostages could just as easily be redirected against the vault chamber's own containment field instead. It was a bluff built on a sliver of truth, one Carter delivered with such calm certainty that Damien found himself unable to determine where the deception ended and the danger began. In the narrow window of hesitation that followed, Carter executed the real plan he had been preparing all along, quietly rerouting auxiliary power away from the vault chamber's secondary locks, while Damien remained distracted verifying threats that did not actually exist. The chamber's rear door released with a soft mechanical hiss, and SWAT operators positioned exactly where Carter's earlier reconnaissance indicated, moved through the opening before Damien fully registered what had happened. The confrontation ended in seconds. Damien disarmed and restrained along with the last of his remaining men, his carefully constructed operation dismantled by the one variable he had never accounted for, a man whose expertise he had underestimated in exactly the same way Alexandra once had. Alexandra was pulled free from the chamber, shaken but unharmed, and as she stepped into the evening air surrounded by flashing lights and relieved cheers, she looked back toward the building with the overwhelming realization that every single one of the 81 hostages, herself included, owed their survival to the man she had laughed at only 2 days before. Paramedics guided her toward a waiting ambulance for evaluation, though she waved off the stretcher, insisting she was well enough to walk on her own. Around her, the parking lot had transformed into a chaotic scene of reunions and relief. Agents debriefing exhausted hostages, medical teams moving between patients, and reporters straining against the barricades for any usable statement. Alexandra found herself scanning the crowd for a familiar face among the strangers, uncertain why it mattered so much in that moment to see Carter in person rather than only through a grainy security feed. She found him eventually, standing quietly near the command tent, still focused on his laptop even as agents around him began celebrating the operation's successful conclusion. He looked up briefly as she approached, offering nothing more than a small, tired nod, the kind of acknowledgement one professional gives another after a difficult job finished well. Alexandra opened her mouth to speak, found she had no adequate words ready, and simply stood there for a moment in silence, grateful in a way she had never before had cause to be. In the days that followed, federal investigators worked methodically through the wreckage of the operation, piecing together not only Damien's motives but the full history of the system he had so nearly exploited. Their inquiry inevitably led back to the old data breach that had ended Carter's career years earlier, and this time, with far greater resources and far less institutional bias, investigators uncovered the original documentation that had been buried for so long. The truth emerged clearly once agents cross-referenced old server logs with internal communications from Carter's former employer, revealing exactly how his design had been claimed by a since-departed executive, and how blame for the breach had been quietly redirected onto an engineer with no power to defend himself. The report was thorough, unambiguous, and impossible for anyone to dismiss as speculation, closing a chapter of Carter's life that had remained open and unresolved for nearly a decade. News outlets picked up the story within hours, drawn by the dramatic contrast between a hostage crisis narrowly averted and the quiet vindication of the man who had made it possible. Reporters gathered outside National Trust Bank's headquarters, cameras trained on the entrance, waiting for any official statement from the executive team that had so publicly dismissed Carter only days before the crisis began. Alexandra, to her credit, did not hide from the moment. Standing before a bank of microphones, visibly humbled in a way few had ever seen from her, Alexandra acknowledged publicly that she had judged a man's character by a hardship he had not chosen and could not have prevented. She described, without excuse or deflection, the assumptions she had made about his past, and the arrogance that had nearly cost the bank its most capable defender when it mattered most. It was, by every account from those present, the most honest statement she had ever given in front of a camera. Inside the bank's offices, the reaction among employees who had once whispered dismissively about Carter's background shifted into an uncomfortable, embarrassed silence, many of them realizing they had echoed judgments they now recognized as deeply unfair. Nobody offered public apology quite as directly as Alexandra had, but the change in tone was unmistakable, a quiet reckoning rippling through a workplace that had learned, all at once, exactly how wrong its assumptions could be. Carter, watching much of this unfold from the modest apartment he still called home, felt no urge toward triumph or retribution. He had spent years absorbing judgment from people who never bothered to ask for the full story, and he found he wanted nothing more elaborate now than for the truth to simply exist where it had been denied for so long. When reporters eventually reached him for a statement, he offered only a brief, measured response, saying he was grateful the hostages were safe and that the past, at long last, had been set right. His daughter, old enough now to understand fragments of what had happened, asked him quietly one evening whether he was famous now, watching his face appear briefly on the evening news between segments about the ongoing investigation. Carter smiled at the question, telling her gently that being known for one difficult afternoon mattered far less than simply being present for the ordinary days that made up most of a life. It was, he realized as he said it, exactly the lesson he hoped she would carry forward long after this particular story faded from the headlines. Colleagues who had once avoided eye contact with him in hallways now approached with awkward apologies, uncertain how to reconcile the quiet technician they had overlooked with the man who had just averted a citywide catastrophe. Carter accepted each gesture graciously, without lingering resentment, understanding that most people had simply followed the assumptions handed to them, rather than forming any genuine judgment of their own. He had learned long ago that holding on to anger cost more than it ever returned. In the weeks following the crisis, National Trust Bank's board offered Carter a senior executive position overseeing the entire security division, a title carrying considerable salary and prestige that many in his position might have eagerly accepted. Carter declined the offer politely, explaining that he had no interest in boardrooms or public recognition, and instead proposed a smaller role as an independent strategic security consultant, one that allowed him to work quietly on the systems he understood best without the weight of corporate spectacle attached to his name. Alexandra, transformed in ways that extended well beyond a single public apology, initiated a complete overhaul of the bank's hiring and evaluation practices, insisting that employment histories alone would never again be treated as a measure of someone's competence or worth. She personally reviewed the policy changes with the same rigor she once applied only to financial projections, determined that the mistake she had made with Carter would never quietly repeat itself within her organization. A formal ceremony was eventually held to honor the first responders, federal agents, and civilian personnel who had contributed to the safe resolution of the crisis, an event attended by many of the 81 people who had walked out of that building alive. Carter arrived dressed simply, avoided the reserved seating near the podium, and stood quietly near the back of the room, uncomfortable with the attention even as speaker after speaker referenced his contribution with evident gratitude. Nobody that evening mentioned the years he had spent unemployed, the divorce that followed his public humiliation, or the quiet struggle of raising a child while rebuilding a shattered reputation from nothing. What people remembered instead, and what they continued to remember long after the news cycle moved on to other stories, was the calm and steady presence of a man who had held an entire crisis together when every official system around him had failed. Alexandra approached him near the end of the evening, offering a quiet word of thanks that carried none of her earlier certainty or authority, only genuine humility. Carter accepted it graciously without bitterness, understanding perhaps better than anyone that people could change their judgments once given the chance to see past the assumptions they carried. The two exchanged little more than a handshake, though something in that simple gesture suggested a mutual respect neither had expected to find in the other. As the crowd slowly dispersed into the cool evening air, Carter walked out alone, carrying with him not vindication or victory but a quiet sense that the truth had finally found its proper place. The value of a person, he had come to understand long before that day, was never measured by the hardships circumstance had forced upon them, but by the steadiness of character they chose to show when everything around them threatened to fall apart. He walked several blocks before calling a car to take him home, preferring the quiet rhythm of his own footsteps to the noise of the departing crowd behind him. The city moved around him as it always had, indifferent to the extraordinary events of the past weeks, and there was a strange comfort in that ordinariness, a reminder that life continued regardless of headlines or ceremonies. He thought of his daughter waiting at home, of the small dinner he still needed to make, of the countless unremarkable evenings that mattered far more to him than any public recognition ever could. Months later, when journalists occasionally still requested interviews about the crisis, Carter politely declined most of them, preferring to let the story settle quietly into memory rather than relive it repeatedly for public consumption. He continued his consulting work at a measured pace, choosing projects that interested him rather than those offering the greatest prestige, content in the knowledge that his worth no longer depended on anyone else's approval. Somewhere in that quiet, steady rhythm he finally felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time, a settled and complete sense of peace. Would Carter manage to save all 81 hostages and force the proud young CEO to finally face the truth?